Hello, and welcome to Stigma Awareness Week and our two-day conference. I'm Shavis Turner, one of the creators of this week-long event, along with Dr. Wendy Oliver Pyatt of Within Health. And I'm thrilled to see that we have almost 1,000 people who have signed up to take part in this important education. We have a wonderful group of instructors who are going to speak to weight stigma and where it shows up and how we can make change. This year's theme is awareness to action, and we invite you to think about how you can address weight stigma in your home, amongst your friends and family, in your doctor's office, at your kid's school, and so on. I firmly believe that we can do better on behalf of those in larger bodies, but it's going to take unlearning the anti-fat biases that lead to weight stigma. As someone who has experienced weight stigma and eating disorders, I'm passionate about this week and the ongoing work because I don't want any child, any teenager or adult to experience the bullying and harassment that leads to body loathing and mental health issues. Just a few small housekeeping items for today. All of the sessions will be available to you on the link to the webinar dashboard you've received. These will be available through the end of the year on the platform and on the Weight Stigma Awareness Week YouTube page. For those of you who would like CEUs, don't forget to fill out your evaluation at the end of the sessions that are eligible for CEUs. Don't forget to follow us on @Weight Stigma Awareness on Instagram. And don't forget about our Instagram live event on Thursday evening, in which we'll be chatting with the founders of Philly FatCon, all about building larger body fat community. And that begins at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Finally, if you would like to ask questions during the session, please click on the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and enter a question. We'll get to as many as possible at the end of the session. All right, so let's get started. This morning, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Rekha Nath. Dr. Nath is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Alabama. She specializes in moral and political philosophy. She has published on global justice, social equality, and responsibility. In her 2024 book, Why It's Okay to Be Fat, she argues that conventional views of fatness in Western societies as a pathology to be fixed or as a moral failing are ill-conceived. Combining careful empirical investigation with rigorous moral argumentation, this book debunks popular narratives about weight, health, and lifestyle choices that underlie the dominant cultural aversion to fatness. Dr. Nath's new book, Why It's Okay to Be Fat, is out now and can be found on Amazon, the Routledge website, and elsewhere. Welcome, Dr. Nath.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Shavis, for that gracious introduction. I want to also give my thanks to Shavis and Wendy and for all of the others who have put in so much hard work into making this important event happen and for inviting me to be a part of it. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be giving this keynote talk, and I'm so grateful to all of you in the audience for being here, and I look forward to getting to engage with you in the Q&A. So I want to start off with a little bit about myself and my own scholarly work in approaching anti-fatness as a social justice issue. Throughout the talk, I'm going to be using the term fat in describing people and their bodies. And following fat studies scholars and activists, I use that term as a neutral descriptor of larger bodies and the folks who have them, and not with the typical implied pejorative judgment, supposing it's bad to be fat. And unless I'm referring specifically to empirical work that relies on BMI categories, I avoid using the terms overweight and obese, as those are terms that problematically presume that having a larger body is unhealthy. A brief word on my own body size. I've never been fat, and for most of my life, I've had a body that would be described as fairly thin. That's not to say that I've been immune to social norms imposed particularly harshly on girls and women, commanding us to be ever more slender. And as a teen and through much of my 20s, I regularly dieted and exercised, trying to conform with an impossibly rigid ideal. As a scholar writing on these issues, because I'm not fat and haven't been, I'm cognizant of how my social location, which comes with it thin privilege, bears on the perspectives that I'll be bringing to the table. And as such, I take seriously the advice of fat studies scholars that folks like me must, above all, listen to fat individuals speaking about their lived experiences and must resist the tendency to avoid speaking for others. So I recently wrote a book, Why It's Okay to Be Fat, that came out with Routledge, as Shavis mentioned, just this past summer. And it's aimed at a general audience for those who haven't really thought about anti-fatness as a social justice issue before. I personally became interested in this issue several years back. Fat acceptance and body positivity were terms that were entering mainstream discourse, and I was struck by the parallels between anti-fatness and other systemic inequalities, like sexism, racism, homophobia, ableism, and much more. And as a social philosopher, I interact in the classroom with a diverse group of students, some training to be doctors or nurses, pursuing careers in public policy or law. And I wanted to be able to have critical conversations about weight and health with my students. At the time, despite there being extensive philosophical scholarship on those other social inequalities that I've just mentioned, there was virtually nothing in my discipline approaching anti-fatness as an injustice. And so I began teaching and working on this topic. And I found that many of my students who were fluent in thinking critically about race, gender identity, disability, when it came to body size, were mostly resistant to questioning the dominant orthodoxy. And as such, the book that I've ended up writing is very much a product of those conversations that I've had over the years with students, as well as with colleagues, friends, family, acquaintances, and in some cases, complete strangers. I wrote the book to facilitate conversations that I wanted to be having to critically interrogate our society's anti-fatness in the classroom, but I hope also far beyond that. In a nutshell, the book argues that we desperately need a shift in our cultural conversation about being fat. As we all know, when our society talks about being fat, it's primarily through the lens of health, starting with the presumption that it's unhealthy to be fat. And this is often framed in alarmist terms, that our nation is in the grips of an obesity epidemic. And on the conventional approach, then, fat is a problem that we must fight. As I argue in the book, this conventional approach is wrong-headed, and moreover, it's dangerous. That's because it obscures a different approach to fatness, one that I think urgently requires our attention. As I see it, we must first and foremost approach how we view and how we treat fat people in the status quo as a serious injustice. We've become so hyper-focused on seeing fatness as a social problem that we fail to see the problem that we as a society have created and continue to perpetuate. The problem that fat people at present are not treated with basic respect, dignity, and humanity. And that must change. My aim in today's talk is diagnostic. I'm interested specifically in diagnosing the problem of weight stigma or anti-fatness. My central question then is, how should we understand anti-fatness as an injustice? By way of preview, my answer to that question is that anti-fatness is a form of oppression. Certainly, it's not conventional to approach anti-fatness that way. So what does it mean? When I say that anti-fatness is a form of oppression, I mean that it's a sociostructural phenomenon one that systematically imposes wide-ranging and unjust harm on fat individuals, and I call this oppressive system sizeism, though I'll sometimes use that term interchangeably with ones that others use in describing the same, including fat phobia or fat oppression. With the talk's central claim set out that anti-fatness is a form of oppression, there's a lot to unpack. So I'll now turn to the task of explaining 3 parts of this claim. First off, in our society, to the extent that we critically reflect on anti-fatness at all, we're typically doing that through the lens of fat shaming. And fat shaming is usually taken to be a matter of individuals expressing anti-fat sentiments in particularly cruel ways. Consider just a couple examples. A fat teacher reports that her colleagues call her the walrus, suggesting she bring 2 chairs to meetings if she wants to sit down. A University of New Mexico psychology professor tweets, "Dear obese applicants, if you didn't have the willpower to stop eating carbs, you won't have the willpower to do a dissertation. #truth." When I talk about sizeism, I'm not in the first instance focusing on mean-spirited individuals behaving in these and other sorts of horrific ways. Fat phobia isn't something that merely or even primarily exists in the hearts and minds of those who hold explicit animus toward fat people. Rather, I'm going to be arguing that it's a socio-structural phenomenon, by which I mean it's something embedded in our everyday structures and practices and ways of life. Frequently, sizeism is perpetuated by well-meaning people acting in subtle and seemingly innocuous ways. The second point I want to underscore is that, again, insofar as we discuss fat phobia at all, we often hear that it harms us all. So for instance, people, and especially thin people, observe that in our looks-obsessed, fitness and health-obsessed society, so many of us, weight status aside, struggle with body image issues and dysfunctional relationships with food. Certainly, these harms do exist, and they can be extremely serious. But we should be cautious about placing too much emphasis on how sizeism harms all of us. Even if inadvertently, doing so can result in thin people hijacking the conversation. In this vein, fat activists point to how the body positivity movement has been co-opted, often by conventionally attractive, thin, fairly thin, white women who are but one minuscule deviation away from satisfying mainstream beauty norms, and who post selfies of themselves with a single small roll of flesh around their midsections, framing this as a deviant act, a resistance to fat phobia. But the worry is that this practice, this co-option, can serve to exclude very fat, disabled, queer, minority, and other non-normative bodies from these spaces. So my framework of sizeism seeks to center our conversation about anti-fatness on a system that distinctively and severely harms fat people in the first instance. They are the primary targets of anti-fat oppression, and that must be our focus. Bring me to the third point. Approaching anti-fatness as a form of oppression underscores the injustice that fat people experience. And so the remedies needed to combat sizeism aren't merely about showing fat people greater compassion. Of course, we should be compassionate toward one another. No one deserves to be shamed, bullied, harassed, or teased for their body size. But all too often, I worry that a call for greater compassion ends up being a call for replacing a fat stigmatizing approach with a more benign, non-shaming approach that's about helping fat people, where helping is about making fat people healthier, and that in turn frequently ends up being about making them thinner. Reorienting the issue as a matter of justice does a couple things. It draws our attention to the socially inflicted nature of the harms that they experience, harms that violate fat people's basic rights and entitlements. When dealing with a systematic injustice, the appropriate remedy is to radically alter our laws, institutions, practices, and so on, so that we stop wrongfully depriving fat people of what they are owed. Furthermore, on a framework of justice, people's rights to respect, dignity, and to fundamental social goods is not conditional on their body size, or for that matter, on their health status. So, those are the basic features that are entailed by regarding fat as an oppressed trait, but that is a somewhat simplistic first gloss. So for one thing, the category of fat involves a spectrum of body sizes. Some fat activists speak of those who are small fats, medium fats, super fats, and infinifats. And where one is along that spectrum within the broader category of being fat corresponds to relative privilege or marginalization. In addition, how sizeism affects a person interacts with other aspects of their social identity, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, class, and much else. Later in the talk, I'll return to some of these intersections. Now, having explained what it means for fat to be an oppressed trait, I'm now going to get into a more in-depth analysis of sizeism, and I'm going to be illustrating specifically how sizeism harms fat people unjustly, harms people structurally, which is to say often in subtle ways and through systematic social forces, and how it distinctively harms fat individuals. And I'm going to begin with some of the most blatant ways that our society treats fat individuals unjustly. First, in most of the US, as well as in most of the world, to be fat is to be deprived of basic equal protection under the law. Though American employers can't legally discriminate on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or disability status, in the vast majority of this country, with very few exceptions, it's perfectly legal to discriminate in the workplace and in other domains like housing against fat individuals. And size-based discrimination is rampant. Studies show that when compared to their thinner peers, fat people are less likely to be hired or promoted and more likely to be wrongfully terminated. Fat women in particular suffer a particularly staggering wage penalty to the tune of thousands of dollars a year. According to one recent study, a woman who weighs 170 pounds and earns a salary of $50,000 is likely making $10,000 less a year than she would if she were working that same exact job but weighed 120 pounds. Second, the Americans for Disability Act codifies an entitlement to reasonable accommodation in public spaces for disabled individuals. And so, for instance, we install ramps alongside high curbs and elevators in multi-story buildings to enable access to those spaces for those who use wheelchairs. This we see as a civil rights issue, whereby we recognize that public spaces are for all members of the public and should be designed accordingly. Yet, fat individuals face significant barriers in navigating myriad social spaces, seating in aisles, on airplanes, on public transit, in workplaces and schools, in theaters and restaurants, fails to adequately accommodate the bodies of many fat individuals. And the cumulative effect of these and other like instances of not fitting is the de facto exclusion of many fat people from social spaces, from being in civil society in general. Third, it's not uncommon for fat people to be outright denied proper medical care because of their size. So, for instance, OBGYN clinics sometimes set weight clinics refusing to accept patients weighing over 200 pounds. Some surgeons require their fat patients to lose a significant amount of weight before they can be eligible for knee or hip replacement surgery. Medical clinics and hospitals frequently lack gowns, exam tables, beds, and equipment ranging from MRI machines to simple blood pressure arm cuffs that would fit larger patients. Drug dosages are worked out by pharmaceutical companies in studies that usually only include normal weight or mostly include normal weight individuals. And consequently, it's been well documented that larger patients don't receive sufficient doses for drugs ranging from antidepressants to anesthetics to chemotherapy. The weight stigma literature is rife with disturbing anecdotes of clinicians who fail to explore plausible diagnoses for their fat patients that they almost certainly would have explored for thin patients presenting with the same symptoms. In one case, a fat patient with distressing symptoms, including coughing up blood and regularly coughing to the point of vomiting, was told repeatedly that her problems were due to her weight and to come back when she'd lost weight. Only after 6 years was she finally referred to a specialist, a pulmonologist, who ordered a CT scan revealing a malignant tumor. She lost a lung, a devastating outcome that could have been avoided had she been referred years earlier to a specialist when her initial symptoms warranted that course of action. Now, these blatant cases, of which there are many more, they only scratch the surface of the injustices that fat individuals suffer in our society. And in what follows, we're going to be exploring some of the more subtle ways that our sizes society penalizes fat individuals. So I want to turn to the work first of feminist philosopher Marilyn Frye, who in her seminal writings on oppression points out that we often fail to see the ways that unjust social forces constrain the lives of oppressed people. And to help show this, she offers a now kind of famous, powerful metaphor. She writes, "Consider a bird cage. If you look very closely at just one wire of the cage, you cannot see the other wires. You could look at that one wire up and down, the length of it, and be unable to see why a bird would not just fly around the wire anytime it wanted to go somewhere." She continues, "It's only when you take a step back, stop looking at the wires one by one, microscopically, and instead take a macroscopic view of the whole cage, that you can see why the bird does not go anywhere." Just as we fail to see the bird's entrapment in this cage if we look too closely, so I'll be arguing that we frequently fail to see the oppressive social forces that constrain fat individuals' lives. And to make this case, I'm going to be turning to an example where we first are going to examine up close the details of a given case and then zoom out. Zooming out will reveal what we often fail to see: how the interplay of systemic sizes forces acting in concert, like the wires of a cage, limit what fat people may have or can do. So consider two behaviors dubbed in the weight stigma literature as healthcare avoidance and exercise avoidance. These are behaviors that studies suggest are more frequently exhibited by fat people than thin people. There's evidence, for instance, that fat people are more likely to avoid healthcare settings, delaying routine cancer screenings, and underutilized healthcare, like going in for annual checkups. Studies also suggest that both fat children and fat adults are less likely than their thinner counterparts to engage in physical activity, particularly in public settings like gyms or at school. These behaviors, the very observation that fat individuals are more likely to engage in such avoidance behaviors, help fuel popular fat-blaming narratives. So it's been well documented that pernicious stereotypes about fat people, which are unwarranted, are widely held by the general population. Fat people are commonly supposed to be, for instance, lazy, weak-willed, unintelligent, non-compliant with medical treatment, and undisciplined. When observed that fat people are more prone to engaging in avoidance behaviors, these stereotypes are commonly reinforced. And it's supposed that fat individuals only have themselves to blame for acting in these ways and any poor health that they might suffer as a result. I'm going to be arguing in what follows that to reason along those lines, as so many in our society do, on reflection is akin to looking microscopically at just that one single wire of the bird cage and being unable to understand why the bird just won't fly away. So, engaging in a macroscopic analysis of the case at hand of exercise and healthcare avoidance reveals that these cases frequently involve oppressive social forces that trap fat people in vicious cycles or negative feedback loops of the sort that's up here on this slide. And in doing so, they inflict multiple interrelated harms on these individuals. So I want to start with the first part of the feedback loop. As we've just seen, anti-fat stereotypes are pervasive in the general population. And what's more, we know that these stereotypes affect how doctors and nurses view and interact with their fat patients. Medical professionals, just like everyone in our society, have been culturally conditioned to hold anti-fat bias. And in fact, a body of evidence demonstrates that these healthcare providers exhibit high levels of both explicit and implicit, that is, subconsciously held anti-fat bias. So a few examples, looking just at explicit attitudes, studies indicate that 69% of doctors and 46% of nurses report biased attitudes against people living with obesity. And healthcare providers, including those specializing in obesity, describe these patients as lazy, stupid, non-compliant, lacking willpower, and undisciplined. High levels of anti-fat bias have also been documented among medical students, nutritionists, and personal trainers. Now, turning to the second part of the feedback loop, predictably, those widely held anti-fat stereotypes and those judgments, they cause doctors, nurses, gym employees, and many other folks to behave in ways that make healthcare settings and gyms hostile environments for fat people. Here I want to turn to the writings of two fat authors describing their experiences in and their feelings about those spaces. First, we're going to consider Roxane Gay, the fat Black feminist author, in her extraordinary 2018 memoir, Hunger. She writes, "When I go to the gym on my own, I always feel like all eyes are on me. My self-consciousness magnifies, and there is, of course, the self-doubt, the nagging sense that I shouldn't even bother, that I don't belong in the gym, that any attempt toward fitness is pathetic, delusional." Next, we'll turn to the fat activist and writer Aubrey Gordon, who anonymously blogged for years as Your Fat Friend and now co-hosts the Maintenance Phase podcast and is the recent author of two excellent books on fat phobia. In the following passage, she describes her dread right before she's about to go in for a medical appointment, having steadfastly avoided going to the doctor's office for 8 years. She writes, "A tidal wave of memories crashed over me. I was submerged. The nurse, who took my blood pressure 4 times, frowning because she couldn't believe it was healthy. The doctor, who prescribed weight loss as aftercare for an ear infection. The doctor who refused to touch me and therefore refused to treat me." She continues, "The flush of my face when I say to the doctor, 'Yes, I eat vegetables, and I cook meals at home,' the familiar look of skepticism that follows, often paired with a long sigh. 'Look, I can't help you if you're not going to tell me the truth.' If I weren't fat," she continues, "I'd been told I wouldn't have gotten strep throat, ear infections, a Charlie horse, or a common cold." These sorts of experiences are exceedingly common. In fact, the weight stigma literature suggests they might be the norm. In Western societies, fat individuals frequently report being treated by healthcare providers disrespectfully, that those providers make upsetting comments about their weight, do not take seriously their very real struggles to lose weight. When it comes to how physicians treat their fat patients compared to their thin ones, They spend less time with them in appointments, studies show, provide them with less education about health, and report having less respect for them. Many report that caring for larger patients is a greater waste of their time. And according to an interesting study that reviewed audio recordings from over 200 patient-doctor interactions, physicians show less warmth and emotional rapport when interacting with fat patients. Now, similar findings emerge when it comes to physical activity. In one study of nearly half of fat adults interviewed in Australia, of the 141, about half of them reported being unwilling to participate in exercise based on an expectation that others would laugh at, ridicule, stare at, or abuse them. Another study found that making overweight women conscious of anti-fat stereotypes led to them feeling less motivation to exercise. And overweight children, especially girls, say they're reluctant to exercise at school because they worry about weight-based teasing and they feel self-conscious about their bodies around others when they're exercising. Now, we can turn to the third part of the feedback loop. It's an obvious point. Of course, when fat people, like anyone else, reasonably anticipate facing stigmatizing, hostile treatment in certain settings, they're more likely to avoid them by, for instance, delaying or entirely avoiding the gym or routine checkups. Doing so is a rational, self-protective mechanism. Observing this to be a common coping mechanism employed by individuals who belong to a wide range of stigmatized groups, social psychologists have coined the term for this tactic, stigma avoidance. And indeed, there are several studies that show us that fat people who have had or who fear having weight stigmatizing experiences are less likely to seek preventative health care or to exercise in public when they're compared to fat individuals who don't report as much. Turning now to the fourth part. Engaging in these avoidant behaviors over time can worsen one's health. Now, most obviously, when a person doesn't go see a doctor for over a decade, they risk not having serious health problems that might have been caught and treated if they were regularly having their vitals monitored and preventative screenings conducted. There's evidence that obese women have an elevated risk for cervical cancer, and that's something that's usually attributed to their higher weight. However, to assume as much ignores the fact that, as a recent literature review notes, overweight and obese women regularly report delaying routine cancer screening specifically due to experiencing weight stigma in those settings. And no wonder they feel stigmatized. As this review continues, 83% of physicians report being reluctant to perform basic pelvic examinations on obese patients. This brings us to the fifth point. Again, it's obvious. What happens when healthcare providers witness their fat patients regularly skipping appointments, or when these patients report to them that they don't regularly exercise as they've been advised by these doctors to do? Those doctors and nurses' preconceived negative suppositions about fat patients are just confirmed. As already suspected, these patients are imprudent, undisciplined, and don't follow common sense medical advice. This brings us back full circle, completing the negative feedback loop. With these harmful stereotypes so reinforced, medical professionals may be even more likely to act in precisely those ways that lead to fat patients feeling, reasonably so, disrespected, mistreated, or otherwise unwelcome or uncomfortable in clinical settings. And so the cycle continues. Plausibly, parallel reasoning holds true when it comes to exercise avoidance. We're now positioned to assess several distinct and serious harms that sizes forces inflict on fat people. One such harm is that an anti-fat cultural environment constrains fat people's agency, which is their ability to form and act upon their own freely chosen goals and desires. Awareness of prevalent anti-fat stereotypes, as we've seen, reduces fat people's motivation to exercise. Fitness, society tells this group, isn't achievable for people with bodies like theirs. And so, as Roxane Gay puts it, there's that perennial sense at the gym for people like her who are fat of, why bother? Do I even belong here? For fat people who do feel highly motivated and want to regularly go to the gym or into the doctor's office, their ability to do so is thwarted by a reasonable expectation of how they're going to be mistreated in those spaces. Notice, thin people don't face these obstacles when they want to go to the gym or to the doctor's office. To be clear here, I'm not suggesting that fat people or anyone else for that matter rationally should be regularly exercising or going in for an annual checkup. Whether doing those things makes sense for someone is a personal matter for them to decide based on their circumstances and their values. My point, however, is that sizeism constrains fat individuals in their abilities to make and to act upon these desires. Sizeism further silences fat people. The philosopher Miranda Fricker explains how members of marginalized groups are prone to suffering testimonial justice. On account of their marginalized identities, such individuals are regarded as less credible than those with privileged identities. For example, when a fat person speaks about her own experiences, like Aubrey Gordon telling her doctor that yes, she eats vegetables and cooks her own meals, others frequently accuse them of lying. Of course, they mustn't work out regularly or eat nutritionally, or they wouldn't be fat, these others assume. Fat people are also often presumed to be ignorant, to know nothing about weight, diet, and exercise, and consequently, they regularly endure what many call thin-splaining, thin people condescendingly lecturing them about their diets and fitness regimes that'll surely do the trick to make them thin, as if fat people haven't heard, and in many cases tried, keto, intermittent fasting, or whatever else it is 100 times before. When someone becomes accustomed to regularly not being believed or taken seriously, this can cause one to experience what the philosopher Christy Dotson calls testimonial smothering. Take a fat patient whose doctor tells her, as many doctors have before, that she must not have tried very hard to lose weight in the past. She remains silent, doesn't bother to set the record straight. She's resigned herself to the frustrating reality that her protest won't be heard anyway. This is to be smothered. As Dotson puts it, it's a coerced form of self-silencing. Being silenced undermines a person's ability to advocate for herself. As we've seen in medical settings, this can be dangerous. The patient whose doctor won't hear her risks being improperly diagnosed and treated. Further, fat people can be harmed for being perceived as less credible when they speak out about matters that have nothing to do with their weight. Disturbingly, one study found that fat women were less likely to be believed than thin women when they reported being the victim of sexual assaults in he said, she said type cases. More generally, being silenced harms one's mental and emotional well-being. To regularly not be heard is alienating and distressing. Even putting aside those serious harms, no one deserves to be regularly treated as if they were ignorant or lying when there's no sound basis for supposing that. Now, I want to turn to a different case, that of Sharon Maxwell, who's a young woman who's been fat her whole life, and for many years from a young age onward, desperately tried to slim down. She's now a fat activist and educator who speaks out about her experiences that I'll be describing. She regularly starved herself for years, eating less than 500 calories a day. Once consuming nothing but water for 2 full weeks, she'd regularly vomit and used a risky appetite suppressant. She experienced a host of troubling symptoms. From age 16 on, not getting her period for about a decade, she often felt cold or dizzy, sometimes in college, passing out in class. She once fainted 3 times in a single day, ending up in the ER as a result. Her hair would fall out in large clumps, leaving her with bald spots. She took to collecting and storing each day's worth of lost hair in a separate sandwich bag, which she showed to a doctor who wasn't particularly concerned, instead praising her for her recent weight loss. Eventually, Maxwell saw a doctor who was concerned by these symptoms and her worrisomely low levels of iron and electrolytes. And when pressed by the doctor about her eating habits, Maxwell came clean. She was informed by the doctor that she might have a restrictive eating disorder and was told she should seek treatment right away. Later, Maxwell went on to be diagnosed with atypical anorexia, a disorder that has all the hallmark signs of classic anorexia: severe food restriction, obsession over food and body image, and frequently significant amounts of weight loss in a short period of time. The one difference is that atypical anorexic patients aren't extremely thin. The devastating symptoms that we see in classic cases of anorexia are much the same for atypical anorexic patients. These include significant psychiatric disturbances, severe malnutrition, risk of failure of all major organs, life-threatening heart issues, and extremely low blood pressure that can account for regularly being dizzy. Now, I want you to consider Maxwell's reaction when her doctor told her she might have a restrictive eating disorder and should seek immediate treatment. She stared at her doctor in disbelief. She always thought that eating disorders were for skinny people. She says, "I laughed. I told my doctor she was crazy. I told her, no, I have a self-control problem." Sizeism produces hermeneutical injustice. This is a term that also comes from Miranda Fricker, and I think it's an apt way to understand what Maxwell experiences. This is something that occurs when, again, due to having a marginalized social identity, a person lacks the conceptual resources that would enable her to make her own experiences intelligible both to herself or to others. Conceptual resources, a technical term used here, refer to the shared vocabulary and the concepts that we have available to us in a social context. Our concepts can help or prevent us from interpreting significant aspects of our lived experiences. Consider that Maxwell knew she was barely eating anything, and she was well aware of her abnormal and frankly alarming medical symptoms. Yet she could not fathom, as a fat person, that she could have a restrictive eating disorder. On reflection, though, it's hardly surprising that years of anti-fat cultural conditioning would prevent her, at least initially, from seeing her behavior and the devastating toll it took on her body for what it truly was: starvation to the point of severe malnutrition. As the journalist describing Maxwell's ordeal writes, she had been so steeped in the gospel of dieting that it was hard to accept that food restriction was not unequivocally healthy. Others with atypical anorexia report similar reactions to receiving the diagnosis. They're flummoxed that they could possibly be under-eating. It's a hallmark of oppressive systems that the perspectives of those in dominantly situated groups are afforded a privileged status over those in marginalized groups. This means that our shared conceptual resources for interpreting what's going on around us are correspondingly skewed. Not only does this mean that someone like Maxwell undergoes the disorienting experience of misperceiving her own reality, but in addition, in an anti-fat society, reality is distorted for all of us. We are all collectively impoverished because we lack appropriate concepts to accurately perceive and understand what's right before our eyes. Anti-fat ideology makes it hard for most of us to believe that anyone could be severely under-eating and yet remain fat. And when many people do not see or refuse to believe that atypical anorexia is a genuine medical condition or one that deserves the same medical attention as classic anorexia, again, despite evidence of nearly identical dangers, this can lead to alarming consequences. When atypical anorexic patients seek help, their medical issues usually aren't taken as seriously as those presenting with classic anorexia. Health insurers frequently deny their claims, and at eating disorder rehabilitation centers, staff may still encourage them to limit their calories when their diagnoses unequivocally show that their bodies critically need more, not less, food. Atypical anorexia is itself a dubious designation, since the disease is thought to afflict nearly 8 times as many individuals as does classic anorexia. It's estimated that about 5% of the population over their lifetimes may experience atypical anorexia, compared to around 0.5% for classic anorexia. Given its high incidence, then, it's likely that many thousands of individuals with this disease are denied proper medical care, all because our society can't accept that fat individuals could possibly be starving themselves. Now, in the final part of the talk, I want to turn to a different centerpiece of anti-fat ideology. This is the message that's conveyed to fat people that fat is not the real you. This offensive anti-fat stereotype is ubiquitous. Consider one example of it that's discussed in a 2015 blog post by the fat activist, writer, and fellow keynote speaker at this conference, Regan Chastain. She draws our attention in this blog post to this disturbing image depicted here, which at the time was making its rounds on Facebook, she says, to advertise a fitness weight loss company. The caption of this image, presumably directed at potential fat clients trying to get in shape, reads, "Your true potential is hidden deep within. It takes a lot of hard work and diligence to sculpt a masterpiece, but once you mask it, it will last forever." Chastain critically interrogates this image and its underlying message, writing, "What's wrong is telling fat people that we should think of ourselves as thin people, covered in fat, a before picture, a perpetual potential future thin person, anything but a fully realized, authentic person." In addition to fat being cast as temporary, as inauthentic, it's further portrayed on this trope as unruly. Fatness is seen as a sign of dysfunction, a trait to eradicate from the body. And this should be done by exerting discipline to sculpt the body so that one can become who she's meant to be. This narrative, in effect, it serves to instill in fat people a sense of bodily alienation or fragmentation, whereby one is told that to regard their fatness, they're told to regard their fatness as something that's separate of who they really are. Quite literally, a fragment to be chipped away, to be removed. This portrayal of fat seems to me to be an apt example of what the Black feminist theorist Patricia Hill Collins calls a controlling image. A controlling image is a reductive stereotype depiction of members of an oppressed group, and as the name implies, such imagery serves the distinctive function of controlling those it applies to. It controls by portraying them not as they actually are, but instead imposing on them an image that obscures their lived reality. In the case at hand, defining and thereby constraining how fat is seen, and moreover, what fat can be. Controlling images, thus, are about power. This image of fat is inauthentic. It demands compliance. It silences fat people and undermines their agency, stripping them of a voice, of personhood, reducing them to this pathologized trait of fatness, which is always seen as something to be fixed. And only when it is, may their personhood be restored. This controlling image of fat, it doesn't arise ex nihilo, out of nothing, that is. As I alluded to earlier, there's no understanding anti-fatness without examining its genealogical ties to and contemporary interconnections with other forms of oppression. And indeed, it's instructive to approach the depiction of the fat body as inauthentic, as unruly, demanding to be tamed via intersections with other entrenched social inequalities. I'm going to be considering briefly just two examples. First, this controlling image quite plausibly has its roots in anti-Blackness. In Fearing the Black Body, the Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, the sociologist Sabrina Strings meticulously documents how anti-fatness, in part, arose from an anti-Black mythic narrative constructed during the transatlantic slave trade. String details how from the 17th century onward, white Europeans began to denigrate fatness, associating it with Black Africans and casting it as a sign of Africans' primitive racial inferiority. Fatness then became socially coded as a savage, reviled trait, a way for Europeans to distance themselves, who were in their eyes disciplined, rational, and not fat, from Blacks, to justify and in part to support the unspeakable brutalities they inflicted on the latter. In Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness, Deshaun Harrison, a fat Black non-binary disabled writer, extends String's analysis, arguing that anti-fatness in the status quo is intertwined with the control and domination of Black bodies, witnessed, for instance, in police brutality disproportionately targeting Blacks. Both authors underscore the depiction of the aberrant, disgusting fat body, regarded as animalistic and primitive, as part and parcel of a racialized construction of Blackness, which for centuries has helped to uphold and to rationalize inhumane, violent subjugation on a large scale of Black people. Anti-fatness also has its roots in a patriarchal system. Far greater social pressure to be thin is placed on women than men, and girls and women are penalized much more harshly than their male counterparts for not conforming to stringent body size norms. For trans, non-binary, and other genderqueer people, these pressures can be still greater. In decades-old work, still disturbingly applicable today, feminist philosopher Sandra Lee Bartke describes the objectification of the female body under the male gaze, instilling in women a desire for thinness. She explains has long been a tool of patriarchal control, whereby women's bodies are made into objects, ones that exist for the pleasure and admiration or scorn and contempt of men. Under the system, it becomes a woman's duty to take care of her body, watching her weight, being radiant, unlined, unblemished, well-groomed, and much more. As Bartke puts it, in contemporary patriarchal culture, most women stand perpetually before his gaze and under his judgment. She continues, the female body is revealed a task, an object in need of transformation. She must exist perpetually at a distance from her physical self, fixed at this distance in a permanent posture of disapproval. Bartke underscores how anti-fatness tends to be internalized by most girls and women, for they're rewarded mightily for conforming to body size norms and punished harshly for not. This portrayal of the fat body as unruly, as needing to be controlled, then, is embedded in both racist and in sexist ideology. When our society approaches fatness as unhealthy, as undisciplined, as unattractive, we must further explore how these admonitions are coded. They should be read as judgments of the racialized other, as judgments of unruly women, of groups, that is, who are to be kept in their places. I've only gestured at, and at that quite briefly, at these intersections with racism and sexism. And moreover, anti-fatness intersects also with classism, ableism, healthism, and other systemic inequalities yet. Certainly, no analysis of fat phobia is complete without reflecting on the immense capitalist interests that profit from it. In 2024, the weight loss industry just in the US is valued at an estimated annual worth of $90 billion. Fighting fatness is clearly a lucrative business, and we can't begin to truly understand or to unpack fatness without attending to its deep roots, without reflecting on its inextricable ties to these other entrenched social inequalities and the powerful vested interests in maintaining those systems. So to conclude, I've argued that we should view anti-fatness as a form of oppression, as a complex, multifaceted social phenomenon, one that's seamlessly interwoven into our everyday and that does devastating harm to millions of fat people. Dismantling the system is a pressing moral imperative, and it's one we must work together to bring to an end. Now, in the last couple of slides, which will be made available online, I include a list of references to the various empirical sources that I've mentioned throughout the talk. And also, the talk draws quite heavily on material from my book, Why It's Okay to Be Fat, as well as from the book's online supplement, which includes a lot of additional material and is available on my website. So to close, thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward very much to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nath. This was really informative and helpful, and I would encourage everyone to get the book. And if you're a clinician especially, I think having this background is really important as you are treating fat folks on probably a daily basis. If anybody has any questions, you are free to put them in the Q&A. We have a thank you in the Q&A, so that's terrific. Lots of thank yous coming in, so I appreciate that. Uh, is there anything that you want folks to know in terms of what you think would be action items from here after hearing what you had to discuss?
Yeah, so as a philosopher, I feel somewhat outside of my depth often, and so I'm familiar with, and I really defer to social scientists on these issues. Some of the potential remedies that I discuss in the book, drawing on structures, are changing our legal structures to address some of those issues that I referred to, of including weight or body size as a protected class alongside all those others to prevent discrimination in the workforce, to make public spaces accessible, right? I wonder just how often classrooms, office spaces are excluding people who don't even come to those spaces because they worry about the tiny chairs in them. Another big thing, of course, given the health emphasis that is part and parcel of anti-fat ideology, is working, and this is a very slow, long process, to implement weight stigma education through the entire process by which clinicians, nurses, everyone involved in public health efforts is educated on. And there's all sorts of important work going on the issue of weight inclusive healthcare, both with physical and mental health. And these models are really promising. And so I think what we need is more of that happening. And it's a model that suggests promotes better health outcomes for people across the size spectrum. So those are just some of the things. And I'll just say one last thing in response, which is part of what I show in this talk and in the book is how deeply embedded, like any form of oppression, sizeism is. And as a result, right, changing our institutions is part of the issue, but we also need bottom-up cultural change. And there's all kinds of important work being done by organizations like your own, by activists, by lots of different groups. But we need a cultural change, and that's actually part of what I try to do by having more of these conversations, by debunking all these dangerous anti-fat myths that persist and uphold our disparagement of fatness.
Exactly, exactly. And that's exactly why we're doing this today. This is very much a grassroots effort. Can you discuss a little deeper about the connections between anti-fatness and anti-blackness, particularly the separation aspect from whiteness?
Yeah. So here, there's So Sabrina Strings and Deshaun Harrison's books are really great sources, and I would encourage those to anyone interested in the issue. But focusing on Strings in particular, right, the common view we come to anti-fatness with is that it's a product of worries about health and perhaps aesthetic norms, conventional views of attractiveness telling us we're supposed to be thin. But what she argues is that far before health concerns with being of a higher weight arose, fatness came to be denigrated, coinciding with the massive slave trade starting around the 16th, 17th century, such that fatness was associated with being Black and therefore constructed as a negative trait. And it wasn't the case that many white Europeans weren't themselves fat, but this was coded as something, as a way to separate themselves from those they treated in a subhuman way. So that's one part of it, but something else that I talk about in the book but didn't discuss here is there are other intersections there as well, whereby if we look at a lot of anti-fatness as it appears in popular discourse and in the media, it often is a judgment of poorer individuals, people in lower socioeconomic classes, and individuals in socially marginalized groups based on race and ethnicity. And so being anti-fat also gets coded as a way, a very subtle dog whistle, so to speak, of taking issue with people that those in the upper echelons of society, want to distance themselves from. And so I think it's important to also realize those ways in which when someone says to themselves that they want to lose weight and be thinner because it's all about their health, what is really behind that has been influenced inadvertently in many cases by all these ways in which fatness and thinness play into social status.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I'm glad you mentioned those authors' names. Their books, Dr. Sabrina Strings and Deshaun Harrison, their books are on the Weight Stigma Awareness website under resources if you're interested. Unfortunately, we have to end here. I know we have more questions and some comments, and I encourage you to continue to watch the sessions today. I am positive, be talking more about all of the things that I see in the questions right now, but I'm sorry we need to go. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of your wisdom and sharing it with us today.
Thanks for having me.